superintendent is probably to be around too.
He's right here. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to a joint hearing between the Assembly Committee on Budget, the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee, and the Assembly Committee on Education. We are here to hear and review the proposal on the ballot for November regarding the tax extension to fund education, health, and healthcare. As you all know, the voters passed Proposition 30 in 2012. It brought in approximately $7 billion into our general fund, of which almost half of that goes towards education. At the same time, while we have been able to repair the devastation that was done in the recession of 2008, the devastation that was done in 2008 and beyond, we still, by any ranking, rank toward the bottom of K-12 per pupil spending. We aren't able to admit all the California students who are eligible into the California State University system or the University of California system. So we still have a long ways to go in order to truly fulfill the master plan that we've been funding for the last 40 years. We have a number of proponents and opponents here to discuss the proposal, but before we start, we'd just like to see if my co-convening chair, Mr. O'Donnell, had any opening words.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair. School funding in California seems to be in a perpetual state of crisis. Despite being the 6th largest economy in the world and having the 3rd highest level of household income in the country, our funding per student continues to be among the nation's lowest. According to the annual Education Week report, Quality Counts, California ranks 46th in the nation in school funding per student. It would take another $3,500 per student or a statewide total of $21 billion per year just to get to the national average, and that's just the average. Our children deserve better than that. They deserve smaller class sizes and more access to counselors, librarians, and school nurses, not to mention music, arts, and maybe even one day, hopefully again, industrial arts. And if we expect our schools to deliver a world-class education, it is our responsibility to provide the resources they need. Schools have 2 main revenue sources, local property taxes and the state general fund. Because Proposition 13 has capped property taxes, the only source of funding that can be used to improve school funding is the state general fund. This initiative may not be the only way to do that, or even the best way to do that, but it's the only serious proposal under consideration at this time. So I look forward to hearing from our presenters and hearing some good conversation about this proposal. And I'm one, that was in the classroom when we went through our last round of cuts, and I saw what it did to our students and our teachers too. Many of my colleagues were let go, but also really the impact on the students, the larger class sizes, fewer counselors, and really ultimately less opportunity for them to succeed. So with that, I turn it back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Assembly Member. Senator Nielsen, who's our Vice Chair of Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee, would you like to say some words?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my esteemed members. To the citizens of California, I have occasion to think about the word temporary, what it means. How many times has this legislature told you these taxes are temporary over the last many years? This was to be a temporary, and temporary really has become permanent. If the legislature is going to continue to do such as this initiative is going to do, and this is an initiative, not the legislative action, but if we, the people, are going to support an initiative, then why don't we just say permanent and make it permanent and be honest? And as we are examining it here in the committee hearing, I will argue that there's no cause to act right now. There's no sword of Damocles descending. Even LAO projections would indicate for Prop 98 funding out beyond 2020, Prop 98 funding will not be going down precipitously. And there are some loopholes in this initiative that I truly believe will be problematic. Mr. Chairman, I do appreciate that we have the opportunity in the committee hearing to examine this. But let it be known that a lot of people who are going to be affected and not sympathetic, I trust, with this initiative are not here today. Don't know about this, whose lives, though, will be affected by it, and a lot of those people are our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. With that, we'd like to start with Mr. Miller from LAO. Mr. Miller.
Good afternoon, Ryan Miller from the Legislative Analyst's Office. I believe you all should have a handout in front of you that our office has prepared. I'd like to start on page 1 of the handout with a brief overview of our role in the initiative process, in case you're unfamiliar with it. In contrast to many other settings where we come before you, like primarily in the budget process, where we may make recommendations concerning administration proposals and other programs, our role in this process is a lot more neutral. State law requires us, when a proponent submits an initiative to the Attorney General, to, with the Department of Finance, prepare an impartial analysis of each initiative. And when initiatives qualify the ballot, we also produce an impartial analysis for the November voter guide. We're in the process of preparing that November analysis. The initiative letter earlier this year came out in January. Turning to page 2, we just wanted to provide some high-level background on the programs and taxes affected by the measure. As was discussed, Proposition 30 increased income tax rates on high-income taxpayers from 2012 through 2018. It also increased the state sales tax rate by 0.25% from 2013 through 2016. Proposition 98 is the state's funding guarantee for schools and community colleges. It tends to grow based on state revenues, the economy, and student attendance. Medi-Cal provides health care services to over 13 million low-income persons in the state, roughly 1/3 of the state population. And finally, Proposition 2, passed by the voters in 2014, is the state's budget reserve and debt payment policy that requires the state to pay down a minimum amount of debt each year and to save a minimum amount in the state's rainy day fund, the budget stabilization account. Moving to page 3 of the handout, we provide an overview of the major provisions of the initiative. First, the proposed initiative would extend the income tax increases on high-income taxpayers from 2019 through 2030. The measure would affect roughly the 1.5% of taxpayers with the highest incomes. There's a table for your information on that page that shows what the rate essentially would be if the taxes were allowed to expire. That is the base rate. The Proposition 30 component, the increase that would be in effect from 2019 through 2030, and then finally the total rate. We note that the proposed initiative does not extend the sales tax rate that's scheduled to expire at the end of this calendar year. In addition, the measure creates a new budget formula for additional Medi-Cal spending. The measure would require the Director of Finance to estimate general fund revenues, subtract from that amount required spending on education, and the costs of government programs that were in place as of January 2016. Up to $2 billion each year between 2018-19 and 2030-31 would go on top of other Medi-Cal funding. And finally, page 4 of your handout provides an overview of our estimates of the fiscal effects of the initiative. Concerning tax revenues, this is a fairly volatile part of the personal income tax, which is also in turn a volatile part of our tax structure. And so it depends not only on what's going on in the economy, but also what's going on in the stock market. Many taxpayers in this group derive a relatively large share of their income from capital gains. For that reason, we provide a range of revenues that may come in over the 2019 through 2030 period, between $4 billion and $9 billion each year in today's dollars. So over time, when inflation has an effect, those amounts would tend to grow over the period in nominal terms. We estimate that roughly half of the revenue over the period would go to increase school and community college funding under the minimum guarantee. Between $0 and $2 billion each year would go to Medi-Cal under the new state budget formula. And finally, between $60 million and $1.5 billion would go for budget reserves and debt payments. That range is largely explained, again, by the difference of capital gains. In poor capital gains years, it would tend to be toward the bottom of that range and toward the top in good capital gains years. After satisfying school and community college funding, Medi-Cal requirements, and Proposition 2 requirements, remaining funds would be available for appropriation in the state budget. And that concludes our testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Are there questions from the committee? Senator Morlock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On page 3, Mr. Miller, you've broken out the tax brackets, but we have information from the Franchise Tax Board that tells us how much of the tax is being generated by these various brackets. Do you have that information?
I have some of the tables. I think it would depend exactly what you're looking for, but...
Well, if I were to just fill in some blanks, just going from memory, you've got taxable income of $263,000 to $316,000, and then $316 to $526,000, and then over $526,000. And I think you said that represents 1.5% of the taxpayers. Do you know how much of the revenues that those 1.5% are contributing to the whole?
So it's a little bit of a challenge because franchise tax boards' revenue data tend to break out these data based on percentages of the taxpayers by income, and so we would have information readily available for, say, the 1% of highest taxpayers, but it wouldn't necessarily correlate exactly with these tax brackets. But all that said, it would probably be a little bit over 50% of personal income taxes. Personal income taxes making up about 2/3 of the general fund budget, and so extrapolating from that, these taxpayers would be funding around 1/3 of the general fund, not including the taxes they may pay under other general fund taxes.
No, that's just the point I want to make, that, Mr. Chair, just a small percentage of people pay half of our personal income taxes. So have you done any analysis, Mr. Miller, on migration? We heard a story out of New Jersey where one taxpayer decided to move to Florida, and it made like $143 million impact on the state's budget because one billionaire moved out of the state. Do we have any data at all? Because obviously this group said, okay, it's temporary, but now if it becomes 12 years permanent, I'm just curious, will they say, hey, we can move to a neighboring state like Nevada and change, because we can afford to do that. And then we can visit our house in California. I'm just wondering, is there any studies in that regard?
Sure. Well, we do monitor the issue closely because it obviously impacts our ability to make revenue estimates. It's a pretty complicated issue, obviously. I mean, people make decisions about where to live based on taxes, but also based on a number of factors. And we follow these stories closely. There are other stories of similar, people or companies leaving, say, for high housing costs, for example. People take into account all of these factors, and some of them are also positive. Maybe the closeness of family and friends, or the weather in California, factors like that. All that said, there have been studies that have looked at prior tax increases on this type of group, and they haven't found a significant effect. But there are factors that might make Proposition 30 or the extension somewhat different. We are just kind of getting good data through, I think, 2014 on personal income taxes. So it really will be a few years before we're able to look at enough data to really draw substantial conclusions.
So maybe one of us should do a bill that sends a fruit basket to these 1.5% taxpayers every year just to thank them for not moving. Just a little fun. Mr. Chair, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Morlock. Just to clarify, you mentioned about the 1% level of income. What is that income level? Approximately.
I'm not sure that I would have that on hand, though. It would be
You want to give it
somewhat higher than the brackets that appear in the table on page 3. The lower threshold in question being $263,000 in 2015 for single filers, $526,000 for joint filers. It would be somewhat higher than that because this is around 1.4 or 1.5% are paying these Prop 30 increased rates that are shown in the figure.
So just to clarify, it's a single person who makes more than $263,000 a year, or a family that's making more than $526,000 a year.
That's right, and it does show taxable income, which would be after deductions and various other tax provisions.
Thank you. Senator Nielsen had a question.
Could the money in the education protection account be used to offset general fund revenue that would have gone to Prop 98 anyway?
Obviously, this is a topic that has been discussed widely since 2012, and what we said in 2012 was that part of the increased revenues from Prop 30 would be used to support higher education funding, that there would be remaining amounts that would help balance the budget. We produced the analysis in 2012, and that was when we still were facing budget problems annually. Now, from another perspective, all of the funds in the education protection account go to schools and colleges, community colleges, but those funds offset other general fund requirements towards education. I think that's kind of a complicated way of saying that the increase in school funding tends to be less than the increase in revenues, as was reflected in the fiscal effects page on page 4.
But this could free up money in the general fund to be spent on other things, could it not?
After satisfying Proposition 98, Proposition 2, and the Medi-Cal formula that would be created by this measure, there would, in most years, probably be some funding left over for general appropriation in the budget. Yeah.
Well, that's kind of my point, that it's not exactly a singular boost to education, that there's some relief on the general fund.
Well, and we would also note that the education protection account is amended by this measure to add healthcare services as one of the uses, so those funds would be continuously appropriated both for education and for Medi-Cal purposes.
And that's one of the huge items that I think the public should be aware of now, that's being added to obligations ahead for us. And the language says, in terms of this Medi-Cal support, which is something new, a new funding obligation, I would say, it says that the tax revenue couldn't supplant existing state general funds. But the question would be, how will existing be interpreted? And that could be interpreted to mean just about anything, could it not?
Well, I think that the Director of Finance, in implementing this provision, will both be making estimates of revenues, of spending under the so-called workload budget calculation that looks at how essentially programs that were in place in January will grow in the future, and there will be choices that they'll have to make in terms of how to implement this. That's potentially one aspect of that. But we would also note that it's not necessarily uncommon for initiatives to have opportunities for, say, the legislature or governor to look at how to implement them after they pass. And for example, we've stressed with Proposition 2 the choices that the legislature has in administering that measure.
Well, and that's something that should be of concern. Obviously, I think it's of concern that we're using this as a whole nother way to create funding obligations, in this case to Medi-Cal, and I would argue another obligation to the state general fund, and I would argue kind of a deceptive way. And in another case, and we've done this in other areas of late, according an awful lot of power and authority to the Director of Finance. And I don't think the public really understands how much power we're giving to the Director of the Department of Finance to make certain determinations, as is the case here. This also talks about, and it's a very attractive provision, limiting spending on the state bureaucracy or administrative costs. But it does allow something that our agencies are famous for. A few years ago, two agencies shifted $300 million that the legislature proscribed for certain purposes, and they shifted it on their own volition, going around the legislature to other purposes that we did not approve of. So the agencies have gotten pretty good at that game. In that case, they shifted it to pay accrued overtime and annual leave buyout. Looks like this is a loophole to allow that could happen here too. It could still get into the bureaucracy. Am I reading that wrong? Because we don't know what that really is going to mean or how that would be interpreted.
Well, again, as I mentioned, the revenues would be used for schools, community colleges, Medi-Cal, and then budget and reserves and debt payments under Prop 2. Again, to the extent that there are revenues left over, the legislature would be faced with decisions on how to allocate that money. But generally speaking, it goes into the general fund pot and is appropriated out to various programs. It's not as though you can sort of parse that out and say what exactly it was spent on, but it would be a general fund resource.
But my point is, fund shifts have become a game in town, a standard practice. And fund shifts could allow money to go into the bureaucracy. Am I wrong? Or administrative costs.
I mean, again, this would just be a general fund resource that would be available for anything, whether it would be additional school funding or, IHSS, really any program. I think that I would probably suggest that you maybe ask the proponents or opponents for their views on that question.
Well, I think they've stated what they think it's going to mean, but I'm trying to get on record what it really means. I don't want to have findings that we want to get to as what facts are. And the vagaries here and the interpretations and the language, including the meaning of the word temporary, I think are very instructive and very important. And I question the intent of the proponents, what they really want to mean here. Thank you.
Before I move to the next speaker, I just want to clarify a couple points. If this passed, what year does it start and what year does it finish?
The personal income tax provisions would, under current law, those increases expire after 2018. So this increase would begin in 2019 and would be in effect through 2030.
Great. And as I look at your analysis, and perhaps I just want to clarify this, in most years, relatively 75% of the revenue that's coming in is going to go to education and Medi-Cal. Is that correct?
Yeah, generally speaking, about 40% I think goes to the Prop 98, and then roughly a quarter or so is on health and human services programs, the largest of which being Medi-Cal, so around half to two-thirds. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Thurman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the presentation. And the Chair's question really starts where I was hoping to go, that because the Prop 98 requirements are so significant, isn't that a fact that these funds first have to go to our Prop 98 obligation? Therefore, this is not some vehicle for allowing transfers of dollars to go to other places. In fact, they have to go to education first and foremost, and then as there are additional dollars, they might support other needs. Am I understanding that to be a fact? Prop 98 first.
Well, again, as we described in 2012 when we did the analysis of Prop 30, again, from an accounting perspective, the revenues that come into the education and protection account, they go to schools and community colleges. But those funds offset are part of our general fund obligation to fund schools and community colleges. So the net effect of those two effects is that the increase in school funding would be less than the increase in revenues. And so we had said in the voter guide that the remainder would be available for balancing the budget, or as it was the case after, I think, 2013-14, just general allocation of the budget after the state didn't have budget problems anymore. We would note that under this proposal, the Medi-Cal funding would also come from the education protection account. So from, again, on that accounting basis, the revenues would go for schools and community colleges, but also for healthcare services.
Let me ask you on this last point you made about healthcare services. I heard it once stated that close to 2/3 of what gets in the way of students' ability to learn in California is not academic, but actually has to do with health issues, social issues, that kids come to school hungry, homeless kids, other impacts that get in the way of student learning. And so the fact that there are dollars identified to support Medi-Cal programs, is that not an opportunity to reinforce our efforts to support student achievement by making a very strategically aligned investment both in education and in Medi-Cal programs?
I think I'll ask my colleague, Jennifer Kuhn, to respond to that question.
That was a nice handoff. I saw her at the ready.
Well, unfortunately, I'm not sure it's going to be a very helpful answer, but I think there is some research, as you indicate, that children being well-fed and healthy obviously affects whether they can be at school, whether they are well-functioning at school. We didn't do any particular analysis of that, so unfortunately we would just be speculating. But I think the general reasoning obviously is sound. So.
Thank you. Can you talk about if we didn't take this action to renew Prop 30, could you talk about what the impact on education would be in your analysis? And I'm making an observation from my own experience in 2008 as a brand new school board member. When I was sworn in, the night I was sworn in, I was immediately asked to vote to close 10 high-performing schools in my district. The reason given that state funding was so poor that we were left with really bad choices for student learners in California. As I understand it, these kind of revenues that we've been provided by Prop 30 prevent us from being in those types of situations. But from your standpoint and your analysis, would you talk about what the loss of funding for education would mean from the standpoint of not renewing Prop 30 in this way?
Well, it really depends upon how the economy performs, not only just in the near term, but in particular over the period 2019 through 2030. And that's obviously a very difficult thing to estimate. Would we have one recession over that period, two recessions over that period? That kind of gets to why we've indicated the revenue increase as a range. We think it's more helpful for voters to understand that those revenues will vary. There are different ways of looking at it. Under the administration's multi-year forecast, they think that we would have a small budget deficit by the time that these taxes would come into effect. Alternatively, our office has estimated that we would have a small surplus, but those estimates are premised on a growing economy, and so if we have a recession between now and then, revenues and by extension school funding may slow. The growth may slow compared to that baseline. It could actually potentially decrease if the economy was very poor. And then longer term, over 2019 to 30, it could be very different. Now, I think that another way of thinking about it is that compared to how the economy is going to perform in the future, if these taxes if this proposal were passed by the voters, Proposition 98 funding over the period would tend to be higher than it would have been if the taxes were allowed to expire.
Mr. Chair, if I could, is there someone from the Department of Finance here? If they'd be willing to address the impact on the loss of these revenues to our overall state budget. Is there someone from the Department of Finance here who could take that question?
We're not seeing anyone, but we can definitely ask.
Yeah, I would like to hear from the Department of Finance. I mean, from my standpoint, as I've mentioned in my previous example, not having these funds would be devastating, both to what we try to do to help California students and ultimately devastating to the California budget. As you point out, a recession is likely and inevitable. And without a measure like this, I don't know how we could continue to bolster what I would call some of the more minimum levels of education funding that we are providing. We are still, 40th or so in per pupil spending compared to other states?
under the federal data's lagged, so as of 2013-14, California was 35th. It fell during the recession from the mid-20s to the mid-30s. And 14-15 was a very strong year in California, and per pupil funding that year increased 14%. It outpaced what was happening in most other states. Again, California tends to be hit more severely during recessions and to recover more quickly during recoveries. So we don't have data for the last 2 years, which were, again, relatively good years in California. So we're probably sort of creeping back toward the middle.
Thank you. I'll yield, Mr. Chair, to my colleagues who may have other questions, but if we are able to get a representative from the Department of Finance to talk about the impact on our overall state budget, the kind of fluctuations that we see, I don't know how we couldn't take this kind of action to bolster our state budget and to protect California education. And I'll yield to see if we are able to hear from someone from the department.
We're working on it right now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. We will now hear from the proponents. If the proponents could please come up. I believe we have Ms. Getman, who's legal counsel for the proponents, as well as 3 speakers and 1 guest. Ms. McLeod, who's Senior Vice President of Health Policy and Innovation for the California Hospital Association. Mr. Reynolds, who's a teacher at the Mount Diablo Unified School District. Mr. Newman, who's a professor at the Los Rios Community College District. And Ms. Lemieux from the California Teachers Association, who's here to answer questions. Ms. Getman, you can start. I'm setting aside 15 minutes, but feel free not to use them all.